In the coming weeks, we'll be studying some plant and animal classification, or taxonomy, as that's called. Today, what I would like to do is just to go over some really sporadic and random content that you may need to know later for what we're understanding. And I think we can do it this way. Let's just look at it today as content. Don't try to take a lot of extensive notes on what you're seeing. I would rather you just look at this and follow along as I'm explaining major concepts. And then later on, when we go back over some of this, we'll pull out that content and look at some specific definitions and things and actually apply that to some taxonomy that we're doing. I also think for you ninth graders and 10th graders in biology, this will help in some of your identification of your plant species that you're looking for, because most of those will probably be flowering plants of some sort. So let's just start with that then. Flowers are an interesting thing to look at on planet Earth, and we'll see some major concepts here, I think, that really point to the Romans 1:20 idea. When you think about what the Creator has done, He hasn't just made a complex amount of just gobs and gobs of content. He's put it together in a very organized and a layered fashion, if you want to think of it that way. I like to think of a way that a composer writes a symphony, and when you listen to a really good symphony by Mozart or Beethoven or someone, they had the skill of bringing little short themes in and out, but throughout the music, those themes would be hidden in different levels of the composition. And it was really a creative stroke and a genius stroke on their part to be able to take those little themes and to expand them in almost an infinite diversity of the ways that you could change and modulate those little themes around. And that's, to me, that's exactly what you see in a lot of biology, but especially I think in the plant systems that we'll look at. So take a look at this flower that you see here. That's a daylily, we call it, and I like it because everything is really large on it and you can see what's going on. That obviously is a flowering plant. So if we think about all life on Earth, don't try to draw this, but once again, let's think of all this like a big mass of hairy content that's all stuck together in a big grease ball in your sink somewhere. And so for right now, let's just worry about that big greasy hairball of content. And then later on, we'll kind of pick it apart and look at some of the individual things. But for right now, just a big greasy hairball. I probably could have come up with a better metaphor, but that's all I've got right now. Anyway, look at life on Earth. So go up to the very top. We've mentioned this once before, but all life on Earth, cellular life, is either made of prokaryote or eukaryote cells. And we'll definitely talk about those prokaryotes later. Eukaryotes, though, will turn into every other thing on planet Earth except for those prokaryotes that you see. And now, notice animals here are kind of on a little limb by themselves here, and every single animal that we'll ever talk about, from giraffes to mice or whatever, are going to be in that one little oval right there with animals. Look at all the different plants that come after that, though. So if I branch off into the plants, I've got the fungi, the algae, non-vascular, things like that. And especially notice as we go down toward the bottom right, we get into this thing called angiosperm again. That's what we want to focus on today. Angiosperm are going to be flowering plants of some sort. Now, let's look closer at those. Do you see what angiosperms just did? If you looked at every seed plant in the world, or those are plants that make seeds and reproduce by seeds, we have the gymnosperms, which are cedar trees, fir trees, evergreens basically, and then everything else that's a tree or a vegetable or anything that has a flower on it is going to be in the other group. And fortunately, we can go one more level because angiosperms are very neatly organized into two other groups called monocots and dicots. But let's just focus right on the angiosperm. That's what we're doing right now. So an angiosperm basically would be, well, first of all, look at this. Those are the gymnosperms, and we don't really need to know those right now. But especially look, angiosperm is on a level equal with all of those gymnosperms. So once again, we get really picky with some things, and then we just take flowering plants and kind of lump them all in together. And the reason is we're not being lazy. It's just that they are so incredibly, they have so much in common with each other that it wouldn't make sense to separate them very much. So angiosperm basically just means covered seed. So that's it. A covered seed plant is an angiosperm. So what do you cover a seed with? A flower. And eventually that's going to be a fruit probably, but flowers cover seeds. That's what they're for. And eventually fruits will cover that seed. And this is a very large group, 300,000 species of photosynthetic angiosperms here. It's the largest photosynthetic group of plants on planet Earth. So if the Creator was aiming at beauty and just spectacular visual stimulus, he certainly got it right with this, because everywhere you look, it's just flower after flower. Now, we're going to say this several times, but obviously the reason for having pretty flowers, we could look superficially and say, well, it's so that pollinators are attracted to you. I kind of think God had a double purpose, though. You can't deny that just looking at flowers, I'm sure he had the artistic, aesthetic reason of just making the earth a beautiful place for us to live in. So let's look at some families. Just real quickly, I want to show you how some of these break down just as families of groups. So you see we've got angiosperms as a whole, and now we can just start looking at just what the larger groups in these called families look like. And that actually is a scientific term. The family is a classification level. So here's one of the largest, in fact, this is the largest flowering plant family on Earth, the orchid group, or Orchidaceae. You'll notice all of these end in ACE, so that's your hint right there that we're talking families. But there are 20,000 orchid species on Earth. So imagine that. The Creator makes one of the most beautiful flowers in an orchid and puts them all over trees. Most of them, though, almost all of them are in the tropics. We only have 2 here in northwest Arkansas, and they aren't nearly as attractive as some of these tropical orchids are. Yeah, here's some of our Arkansas right here. We have ladies' tresses. It's just a simple little spike with a spiral of little insignificant flowers on it. And if you're lucky, around some mountaintops, you'll see ladies' slippers. A little bit prettier. I mean, it's not like some of your really brilliant orchids, but it's the best we've got right now. Some of the exotics, though, I mean, look at this, just really complicated. And what's complicated is they have very complex ways of pollinating themselves or spreading pollen. Basically, an insect has to go and flip a trigger to pick up the pollen to take to something. Okay, the second largest group of plants on planet Earth, or family, are the Poaceae, and that's just the grass family. We are very dependent on this. 10,000 species, about 20% of Earth's vegetation is in the form of some kind of grass. And we're basically talking cereal crops here, because cereals are grasses. And you'll notice they are monocots, so we'll see that later too. Yeah, look at all of the crops that we have that are grass plants. We depend heavily on these. In fact, these are the carb crops that we keep talking about for most people, either corn, wheat, or rice. Most of the world eats those 3 things in some form. Another family I put in just because it's kind of interesting. If you look at those flowers and compare them to other flowers, you'll see this is called poison nightshade, and it is poisonous. There's also one with yellow berries. It's quite poisonous. But this is the tomato, potato, pepper, eggplant family. So look what's in here. And you can tell they're all pretty similar because peppers are almost like dry tomatoes. And if you look at a petunia, the little fruit under the flower looks like a tomato. Now, a potato, though, remember, is not the fruit. That's a tuber. If you literally could look at a potato flower, you would see a little tomato growing on it, just like a tomato, except we don't tend to eat potato flowers or fruits. Another large group here, 3,000 species. That's the rose family. The top one is what they look like in nature. And the bottom one is how we've bred these to just be beautiful and overbearing as far as numbers of petals and things like that. But in the wild, a rose is just a very pretty 5-petaled flower with a lot of little stamen in the middle of it. Look what's in the rose family, though. I mean, just about every fruit that's in your garden, a fruit tree or a viney fruit that's growing somewhere, these are all somewhat similar to each other when you start thinking about how the flowers look. Lily family, just to show you that not everything has to be spectacularly beautiful. Onions, garlic, chives, things like that are in the lily family. Those typically have blade-like leaves that are kind of fat, and you probably have guessed daffodils would be in that group, and perhaps other things like irises. But yeah, most of your spring flowering bulbs are in that group. The purple one that you see here actually is an onion flower. If you let it go to the second year and flower out, got a real pretty purple globe looking flower that comes from it. Now here's some more in that same family. Now this one's a little bit confusing because when I look at this, I think I'm seeing a flower because everybody thinks, oh, daisy flower or sunflower or something like that, black-eyed Susan. And really, when you think about it, you think of a flower, you pick it up and go, she loves me not, she loves me, she loves me not. And you start pulling off the petals. Those are really not petals. So look at that. Take a close look at it. What do you see when you look at that thing we're calling a flower right there, compared to one of the ones we just saw earlier? The name of this group is Asteraceae. Aster means star. So if you'll notice, everything in this family looks kind of the same, just a bunch of petal flowers coming off of it. We would call those petals, but they're really not. Those are actually the flowers. So I'm looking at this purple one. It looks like it has about 20 little petals. Those things we're calling petals are actually the flowers. So it has about 20 flowers in what's called a calyx going around the middle. And if you look carefully at the middle, like on the white daisy there, the yellow part in the center actually is made of hundreds of little tiny, almost microscopic flowers. So a better way of describing this family is what looks to be a flower actually is a cluster of flowers. And we're going to call that something later. An inflorescence is what we call it. And that means almost every flower you see that has multiple petals on it, think about it. It either has 4 or 5 petals or 3 or a whole bunch of them. If it's got a whole bunch of petals, those probably aren't petals. They're probably just flowers clustered around the petal. I'll show you some of these in lab to prove it sometime. A few other miscellaneous families, the Cucurbitaceae family. Cucurbits are cucumbers or something in that family, like gourds and pumpkins and things like that. The fruits are called peepos, believe it or not. Yeah, cucumber, squash, pumpkin, watermelon, cantaloupe, gourds, and you kind of see a similarity there. The fruit looks similar, and the flowers all look similar to each other. So anytime you see similarities in the plant world, that's a really good giveaway that it's probably in the same family as something that looks like it. Now another big family here, the bean family. Anything that looks basically like a bean that can shell on 2 sides, we would call it a pod. That would be a Fabaceae, and they're important on Earth because we just mentioned the idea that nitrogen in the air has to turn into nitrates in the soil. These plants, with the help of bacteria, can actually do that for us. So when you grow Fabaceae plants, you're literally putting fertilizer in the soil for free. You don't even have to add nitrate fertilizer. Okay, back to this thing angiosperm again. Angiosperms, we divide them into 2 smaller groups, the monocots and the dicots. You can tell already mono is 1 something, di is 2 something. So what's a cot? It's pretty easy. It's really short for cotyledon. And so look on the picture here. The one on the left is a corn sprout coming up, and that is made of 1 little seed leaf. I mean, when corn comes up, it just shoots 1 little spike up, and that's a cotyledon. So it's a one cotyledon or a monocot. The thing right beside it has two cotyledons. And most other plants, if it has a seed, you're probably familiar with a seed popping open and the two halves of the seed open up, and you have two cotyledons or a dicot plant. Okay, it's more than that though. Look at what else you've got. Here's a dicotyledon that I've opened up. So you've got lots of food for the baby. That's what the cotyledon is. It's just stored baby food. Remember, we said the mother's job is to make a lot of carbs and proteins right here for the cotyledons. Here is actually the little baby plant. So you've got the root, the stem, and the leaf right here. And that little baby is just going to take off, and for a few days it will eat this baby food here while the leaves get big enough to start photosynthesizing. And here's just a shot of a monocot, like a corn. It just has a single plumule that will come up right here to be the single cotyledon that comes up. Something else to look at, if you really look at the petals, and if they truly are petals and not an inflorescence like the Asteraceae, if you see multiples of 3 on something on the petals, you got a monocot. If you see multiples of 4 or 5, you've got a dicot. Now, most of the time, these don't get up into the big numbers. So monocots, you're either going to see probably a 3 or a 6. Dicots, you may see a 4 or an 8 or a 10, sometimes a 20 or a 15, but usually not. Usually it's just 4, 5, or 3. And those are for the flower parts, not for leaves. So a 3-leaf clover doesn't count. Those are leaves and not flower parts. And if we had a microscope, we would see that a monocot piece of pollen, that's the sperm cell that's going to fertilize an egg somewhere in another plant. It usually looks like this with one little pore on it. And a dicot pollen has 3 little slit-like pores on the sides of it. And this is real obvious here. When you look at a monocot, you're looking at a blade for something. So we typically call it a corn blade or a grass blade because grasses are monocots. And so they will have parallel veins as opposed to broadleaf plants over here that have a main vein with branches coming off of it. So if you see branching anywhere on a leaf, you got a dicot. If you don't see branching, all just parallel, you've got a monocot. And once again, these are oval-shaped leaves or weird-shaped leaves. These will be mostly just long, skinny, tapered, blade-like things coming off the plant. If you cut it open, there are still differences you can find. Monocots typically have scattered little monkey faces. Isn't that cute? So you cut a young stem open, it's just full of dozens of little monkey faces right here. In a dicot, these don't really look as much like monkey faces, but they're always around the outside edge of the covering of a dicot stem. And we've cut this cross section, so we're looking down the stem right now into the plant. But those are the water and food carrying tubes that we've cut open. The eyes on the monkey and the forehead, those are tubes that we've sliced, and we're looking into the tube right now. Roots are pretty different too. Monocots typically have fibrous roots that just spread out all over the soil. Can't go back to that. But dicots usually have root systems that are one single long root that we call a taproot. Think of a carrot. A carrot is a good example of a dicot because it has one skinny long root with a bunch of little roots coming off of it. Now, this is important too because on a monocot, where does the growth happen? It actually happens closer to the bottom of the plant. On a dicot, the growth happens all over the plant. So you get this interesting thing happening. What happens when a buffalo or a cow or deer comes and grazes on a prairie made of monocots and dicots? Yeah, you'll have the animal eating off all of this stuff on a grass plant. But if it does it, it's not hurting the growth region, which is down at the bottom. This just keeps pushing up more plant. If, on the other hand, you come in and bite off the end of a dicot plant, you've pretty much bitten off all the growing regions, and the plant usually will just sit there and that will be the end of its life. So mowing and grazing favors grasses such as monocots, and it tends to disfavor broadleaf plants, dicots. Yeah, that's what the buffalo is doing there. And buffalo are good. They tend not to just to graze one plant. They're equal opportunity grazers that will graze grass and broadleaf plants, which is an advantage over cattle and horses, people would say. So just a few pictures here. Those are bluets, dicot or monocot. I see 4 petals. I'm thinking dicot. Can't really tell flowers, but it looks like just a bunch of little tubular leaves coming up. Kind of like a lily family. So, yeah, those are wild onions. So it's in the allium monocot group. It's an experiment we did earlier. Okay, so let's move up a level now. Let's look at what a seed actually looks like. So in most plants, the seed is very safely tucked away in a fruit called an ovary. And we may as well get used to that too. The ovary is the fruit of the plant. So in an animal, the ovary, remember, is the place where a baby grows. Same thing in a plant. The baby is tucked away safely inside of the ovary. The mother's ovary is here. So this part is the mother's body. This part is the body of the next generation growing inside of the ovary. And we got lots of different variations on ovaries. This is another theme that you notice, much like a composition, because God uses the same sort of layout plan here, but he does all kinds of creative things in the number of carpels. But that's what this is. It's just a single part of a flower called a carpel. And as you can see, it's got a seed and an ovary right here. So it's a thing that holds an ovary. And in flowers, sometimes we'll learn these and memorize them later, but you call the place at the top where a butterfly something lands the stigma, and the tube that connects it is called the style. So we're looking at a female flower here because it has an egg and an ovary, and the style and stigma are female parts that make up the thing called a carpel. So variations on it. Here's a triple carpel where it's kind of grown together. Here's a carpel that's one single carpel, but it has the ovaries fused together. So start thinking, what would the fruit look like from these various shapes of flowers? Because you'll start to notice that a lot of times the fruit resembles the flower, because the flower is the thing that ultimately is going to lead to the fruit in some form. Okay, real quickly, and this is something we're going to skim over quickly for now too, but let's look at a female flower. This thing in a female flower that produces the embryo, later we're going to call it a megasporangium, and we also have a thing called a microsporangium coming up. But eventually, this will undergo 4 cell divisions, and like I said, you don't have to memorize this right now. One of those will keep on growing, the other 3 will kind of shrivel up and get smaller. And then that one will divide into 2, which divide into 4, which divide into 8. And then when it gets to 8, they start separating out into 3, 2, and 3. So I say all of this just to say, man, this is complicated, isn't it? It's not just random stuff once again. And we keep saying that, but God has a plan. He sticks with it, and there's going to be a method to this. We'll see later, a reason why this is happening this way. So keep up with that. We call it the first mitotic stage, the second, and the third. Now let's watch what the male plant is doing, because on a particular plant that may have male flowers, the male parts are on these kind of things that stick up on a bulb right here. A lot of flowers, you look in the middle and you can see a stem with a little enlarged place on it. Inside of that, we're going to have microsporangium tissue that eventually will just divide like crazy into a whole bunch of pollen grains, we call them. So that one microsporangium just kind of divided over and over and over, we'll say into 50 to 100 pollen grains. So that's pretty simple. That's the male flower. So we've seen female and male. And then that pollen cell, watch what it's going to do. It has one cell inside which quickly divides into two cells. And one of those immediately starts growing and become a thing called a generative cell. The other one shrinks a little bit and becomes a tube cell. And then watch this. When it lands on a plant, it's not just a random falling of a pollen grain. There's definite chemistry that goes on here. I know it sounds romantic, but it's not. It's just chemistry. But when the male orange pollen lands on the female stigma, a chemical reaction starts, and the tube cell immediately goes down to the stigma and starts just dividing over and over and over and turning into a tube. And that tube just starts growing into the stigma and the style. So you can kind of see it here, the little green tube that just grew all the way down to the embryo that's down here. Essentially, you just made a pathway for the sperm cell to go. So now the pathway is created, and the sperm cells start swimming down into this tube right here, because this, remember, was the stigma of the female flower. We landed a pollen grain on top of it. The pollen grain hatched into a sperm and a tube cell, and now the sperm cell starts swimming down, and it keeps on going. During the trip, though, it divides into two separate sperm. So mitosis just gives us two instead of one. And both of those will go down, keep on going. When they get to those 8 female cells that are there, one of those sperm will join the top one will join the middle part of it. Pretty complicated. And then you have really interesting things that, depending on whether you're in biology or college biology right now, we will go into very specific things happening here. But do you see what this is? This is the young fruit or ovary starting to form on the plants that's there. We have a fertilized egg starting to grow into a new individual right there before your eyes. This one's upside down from the previous one, but it shows all the parts still there. And here's an actual microscope drawing of it. The two darker things are stained blue there, just so you can see where they came from. Now, your book, depending on which book you have, will show some interesting variations on this. We're going to go to that later, though, because that is complicated stuff. But once again, we expect that, don't we? We expect complexity from a creator, but at the same time, the simplicity of all of this stuff happening the same. So I'm looking at what looks like a lily flower here. This could just as easily be a pineapple flower or something else, because they're all going to follow the same general floor plan for what's happening. We kind of mentioned this earlier. Why are flowers pretty? I mean, you can take this anyway. We can't read God's mind. So God could have very easily just made flowers just so our life is better, because it's just better when you look at flowers. But look what a flower actually says when something's flying over it. You kind of notice that? It's a target with a definite target in the middle that says, aim here, I'm right here. And for most pollinators, this is interesting too. A lot of pollinators can only see one frequency of color. So when that honeybee or butterfly flies over, there's a good chance it's not seeing you and the ground and your car and everything else. It's seeing only the color that it's programmed to see, which probably is the flower that it's intended to pollinate in some form. So yeah, this particular yellow flower here would be very attractive to a honeybee, because honeybees are attracted to that type of yellow. And they would, flying over a prairie, perhaps that's the only color they see, are these little star-like landing pads that are all over the prairie. Makes it pretty easy to find where you're supposed to land. Here's a monarch pulled to or attracted to a milkweed flower. Obviously, its color is purplish looking, so it would tend to go mostly to a purple flower. Have you ever had a butterfly just try its best to light on you, and you're trying to brush it away, and it keeps trying to light? Probably you're wearing a colored shirt or dress or something that it's attracted to, and it thinks that you're just a big walking flower of some sort, which I'm sure you are. Your mother probably called you that. Yeah, amazing, isn't it? Just queuing right into those flowers, knowing exactly where to go for that pollen. And we have bat pollinators too. Bats don't see colors too well, so if something is bat pollinated, what do you think that flower would be like? Because bats are out at night, they don't use colors, obviously. I'm thinking smell, and they're going to be pulled probably to something that just stinks like the daylights. And that's usually true. Bat pollinated plants typically have a pretty putrid smelling flower, and the bats smell it as probably fermenting fruit that needs to be, the seeds need to be taken out of and eaten in some way. Yeah, this bee is doing an overtime job here. Look at all the pollen. So definitely when it lands on another flower, that flower is going to pick up pollen from millions of other plants, I'm guessing, out there somewhere. Yeah, this is that orchid I was talking about. If you look toward the inner part of an orchid, this is so complicated because the wasp that pollinates it, and it will be by a wasp, they have to be strong enough to get into the orchid, but it will push its way under those two little white things right here and jam its way up into this area. And when it hits a certain little lever in here, a little blob of pollen comes down from, I think it's right here, and it just acts like a spring and goes ka-chunk and glues a little pollen sac to the back of the wasp. And then when the wasp goes to another orchid plant, it has to crawl in a similar feature thing that goes, and here you see it here, it's about to get this little pollen sac deposited on its back right here. So it pushes farther and farther. Eventually it will touch something here, which will go punk, and this thing falls down and attaches its pollen. So amazing, isn't it? That's just incredibly a complicated way for pollination. But orchids have it down to an art. They only want to be pollinated at just the right time by just the right creature that they know will now go to another orchid plant. Yeah, there's one that's actually picked it up, and now it's going to go and take this little pollen sac and deposit it here when it tries to swim down into the orchid. What do you think those are? Yeah, they smell about as ugly as they look. They're called carrion flowers, and basically it's just rotting stuff on the inside that stinks worse than a Bigfoot, they say. And Bigfoot stink really bad. But these attract flies, because flies also can be pollinators. And if you're going to attract a fly, the best way to do that is with rotten meat. And so these literally smell like just rotten pieces of steak or flesh decaying on the ground in a forest somewhere. So are there ugly flowers? I'm looking at grasses here like corn and Bermuda grass and other things. Not quite as pretty as some of the flowers you just saw. So does that tell you about something, how this plant might be pollinated? If it doesn't have a pretty flower, it probably doesn't need to attract an insect using color. If it doesn't stink, which they don't, they have no smell, it probably is not attracting bats or flies or something like that. So what do we got left? You got it, random wind blowing. And typically if you see just what we would call a kind of a non-attractive flower, not necessarily ugly, that would be on a grass plant, because grasses are typically wind pollinated. And that's why they're so hard to manage, because when the wind blows over the prairie and goes sweeping down the plain, it just picks up billions of pollen grains and spreads them randomly over whatever plants are there. Yeah, here you see it happening big time in a wheat field. So no insect pollinators here. It's all just